Thanks everybody for coming today. We want to give a brief overview of a FASTTRAK security update that's going to be coming to you guys in the next month. We'll go into some details of that, specifically what is going to be expected of our operators with our support, of course. And we just want to run through and give you a heads up on what's going to be occurring and where you guys need to be. So on the panelists today, we have myself. If you don't know me, I'm the CTO at FASTTRAK. I manage all the IT engineering and DevOps. We also have Brian Hood, which most of you probably know. He's Director of Customer Support. He manages all the customer support operations. And we also have Eddie, the President and owner of FASTTRAK, which basically oversees all the FASTTRAK operations. So those guys will be answering questions here today as well as we go through the webinar. Real quick, a couple things. Just to interact with the webinar, the plan is to go through some of our content. We're going to try to get through it as quickly as possible because we want to open it up to questions. We know that our operators are going to have questions about the pending security update. So once we get through the slides, we answer a lot of those questions. We'll give you guys a chance to interact with us directly. In the meantime, if you do have questions as we go through the webinar, the best thing to do is to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, you'll get a list of current questions. And at the bottom, it allows you to ask your own question. If you go ahead and just type in your question there, either myself, Eddie, or Brian will go ahead and, most likely if it's pertinent to the conversation, we'll go ahead and stop current discussion and answer it live. Otherwise, we might hold on to it till the end or answer right there in the chat box. So just open up the Q&A area to go ahead and ask those questions during the live webinar. I went ahead and disabled the chat, which is another option there just because it seems to confuse of where to put the questions. So I've disabled the chat for now. So just any questions put in the Q&A section. At the very end of the webinar, when we open it up to live questions, if you would like, at that time you can raise your hand by clicking the hand button on your toolbar. And that'll notify us that you want to ask a question, at which time we can go ahead and unmute your mic and you can ask the question live to the audience. And of course, if you don't want to ask it live, you could always type it right in the Q&A box. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. So you've heard a little bit about the FASTTRAK security update. What exactly is it? Well, FASTTRAK has progressed over the last, for several years across a variety of applications. At one time, we have simply just the ultimate desktop application. There's a set of users that are managed within the FASTTRAK desktop. We call it FASTTRAK Ultimate Application. You know, a few years back, we also released the FASTTRAK Express application to allow some users, usually users that are offsite, not in the office, to have access to the FASTTRAK software. And it's a web application. And what needed to be done to give users access to that application was we created what were called FASTTRAK Express users or web users, which worked well for a few years. But over time, operators found it difficult to start managing users in multiple locations. They found that sometimes users wanted access when they're in the office, and sometimes users wanted access when they were out and about on the web. And also we released the driver app, which sometimes our users want access to those too, plus they want access to the driver app. Long story short is as the applications progress, the complexity of our user security increased. So overall, the FASTTRAK security update is in an effort to unify the login process across all of our apps. That's going to require a unified username across all of our apps. And we'll go into more detail in each one of these. But in general, every user login into a FASTTRAK application, whether it be Ultimate, Express, Driver App, Next Generation, or anything else coming in the future, they will use that single email address. One of the difficulties operators had in the past as well was being able to let their users self-manage themselves in case of a forgot password or something of that nature. So we're putting mechanisms in place where your users, your employees, your dispatchers, those type of persons, whether they access the FASTTRAK Ultimate desktop application, the Express applications, the driver app, or any other app in the future, they will be able to self-service their own password resets and password recovery processes instead of having to call up the operator and have them to reset the password manually. So that's what the global security update is going to help as well. We have some operators that have what we call multi-system logins, which we'll get into a little bit more. But basically, a user who, for one reason or another, has access to multiple systems. Maybe it's a third-party operator, maybe it's a GNet support group, whatever it may be. Currently, you have to manage separate usernames for every system, and we're going to go ahead and roll that into what we call multi-system support. So those cross-system users will now be able to use a single login as well. In the last 6 to 12 months, we've released what we call linking. It was our attempt to make it easier for operators to address the situation where you might have a person who uses Ultimate EXE, and they're created a FASTTRAK user there, but they also want to do the web. So they had initially 2 separate usernames, and we introduced some linking that allows them to combine those together such that they can share a username and password. It was still 2 independent systems. We just did some legwork up top to make it a little easier to manage. But in general, that was more of a short-term Band-Aid instead of a long-term solution. So part of this global security update is going to rely on some of those links, but ultimately we're going to give you a much simpler way to give access to any FASTTRAK application. It'll be a way to create a user and say, I want them access to desktop, I want them to have access to web, I want them to have access to the driver app, very specifically for each one of those applications in one place instead of multiple places. And we'll talk about that. And then this FASTTRAK security update goes along with a lot of the broader FASTTRAK security updates we're doing. Without getting into too much detail, all the APIs, the integrations, the third parties, the affiliate updates and all that kind of good stuff. A lot of talking between systems. There's been a lot of updates in that process recently, and this is a part of that much broader security update just to make sure that's as secure as possible. We tentatively scheduled the transitions from the old security to the new FASTTRAK Security 2019, starting by the end of this month, and we'll have additional updates after this webinar also to let you know how we're going to support that process for you. So what is expected of you? I'm making an assumption for the users that are attending the webinar that they are familiar with user management within FASTTRAK. They are familiar with user management within Express. They are familiar with how to give a driver access to the driver app. We'll go into it briefly, but we don't intend to go to a deep dive. But some of the screens that I'll show you, very simply, you can get to it in the FASTTRAK application. I'll walk you through that quickly. So what is expected of you? We want all of our operators to review all user accounts, both Ultimate and Express accounts, as follows. Any account that you no longer need, delete it. It's as simple as that. Whether the user has left your organization, no longer employed by you, that username was a test user, temporary user, something that's no longer needed. One of the simplest things you can do to make the upgrade as smooth as possible is just to remove any users that you no longer need access to the system. The second thing you can do, so the second thing you need to do is we're going to start on the FASTTRAK Ultimate side, the desktop side. Within FASTTRAK Ultimate, you can manage your FASTTRAK users, FT users. You need to review your user list and simply make sure that every one of your FT users has a unique email address. Generally speaking, when we do an audit on a database, what we see is usernames instead of Adam@fasttrak.com, you'd have Adam Morrison, for example, or A Morrison as a username. We already manage the email address as part of a FASTTRAK user, but we didn't combine the username and the email address. So as part of you reviewing your FASTTRAK users, we want to make sure that every FASTTRAK user is an email address. So that's the second thing you need to do. The third thing you need to do is look on your FASTTRAK Express side. So within FASTTRAK Express, there are some ways to do some linking, which I'll show you in a second. But in general, every one of your FASTTRAK Express users needs to either be linked to your Ultimate user or has to have a username, which is a unique email address within your system. And I'll show you those screens in a second. The last one is if it is an Express-only account, meaning it's not linked to a FASTTRAK system. This is the older way of doing it, and quite frankly, this is probably the majority of our Express users. They're not linked currently. If it has no coordination with a FASTTRAK user, It just needs to be changed. The username needs to be changed to be a unique email address. So across the board, the login username needs to be a user email address. One of the reasons why we want our operators to be able to do this ahead of time is because our operators can then manage the timeline. So instead of FASTTRAK saying, we're going to upgrade your database on January 1st, and then all of a sudden on January 1st, you get calls from drivers or employees and saying, I can't log in. What this does is it allows you to incrementally manage when this occurs. So you can start this today, and you can get compliant with the new username, the new email address usernames today, and you can manage and say, for example, on Sunday night, I'm going to change your email address, or excuse me, your username login to your email address. You can convey that to your users as necessary, and you can completely manage that timeline according to whatever schedule you need. So that's probably one of the main benefits of you doing this ahead of time, is not only cleaning up your system and making it more secure by getting rid of users that are no longer needed, but simply being able to manage when and how those users would log in with their new email address. And we'll talk for specifics on that in just a minute. So from a FASTTRAK standpoint, so let's say you've cleaned up all your system. The next step was to make sure your FASTTRAK user accounts, your ultimate accounts, have a username, which is an email address. The screen you're seeing here is basically a, This screen you're seeing here is basically the FASTTRAK user edit screen. As you can see, there's a username field and an email address field. We left those there for just, past reasons. We didn't take them away. But as part of this release, we will be hiding the email address field, and we will have just a single field. So as part of the security update, you simply need to go into this FASTTRAK user and make sure that that username is changed to that email address, and that email address is unique in your system. And that's all you have to do from a FASTTRAK Ultimate user update. Now, going over to the Express side, this is where it gets a little more tricky, and not from a how-to standpoint, but just to explain it. As I said, with an Express, the old way of doing it was just creating an Express user who was completely independent from a FASTTRAK user. And then 6 to 12 months ago, we gave you a way to link the two together so they could share a username and a password. But under the covers, it was still two separate accounts. We just did the legwork for you. So if you open up a FASTTRAK Express user, at the very bottom, you'll have user type options. This is where you choose to say that, hey, this Express user is actually this FASTTRAK user, and I would like those two users to have the same username. So if you have an account, for example, that has a login to FASTTRAK Desktop, but they have a separate login to Express, but it's the same person, you would want to link that Express user to this FASTTRAK user here. That will make sure that these users share that login information. Why that's important is because when your database gets migrated to the new global security, we will see that there's a link there, and we will treat those as the same user within that unified login. If you continue to keep those users separate, one, they'll have to have separate user email addresses, but they will be treated as two independent users, which is generally not what you want. If it's truly the same person accessing those two systems, then you're going to want to link those and use the FASTTRAK Ultimate user link, as you can see here. Now, remember, you'll want to have updated your FASTTRAK Ultimate usernames before doing this, so that when you do the link, it's linking to a valid FASTTRAK Ultimate user with a valid FASTTRAK Ultimate email address. So to make sure you just follow those steps, do your FASTTRAK Ultimate first, and then go into Express and start working on your Express accounts. There's no needed updates within the Express account if you do this link, because the current FASTTRAK software will go ahead and update that username to that FASTTRAK Ultimate username. So it's very important. So let's say, for example, you had a FASTTRAK user who logs into the desktop version, and they use their email address currently. But you have that same person who logs into the Express software, but they use just a username like user1. Once you do this link, that Express login is now going to use the same username as the FASTTRAK Ultimate. So for example, if my FASTTRAK username was adam@fasttrak.com, Once I do this linking operation, I'm going to log into Express as adam@fasttrak.com. So it's very important that once you make this username change, that needs to be conveyed to that user so that they can begin using that login name immediately. So once again, this is how you can manage when that happens. If you want to try it out with one user first, maybe a group of drivers first, maybe your internal users first, you can certainly do that however you would like. It allows you to roll those changes out to your users as to whatever schedule you want to. As long as it's done, our goal is to get everybody done by the end of this month. By all means, you can start this today to make sure you're up to speed on the new account settings. The next one we'll talk about is an Express-only user account. So an Express-only account is the ones where it's an Express user that has no counterpart within FASTTRAK. So it's purely a user that never has to access the desktop software. They only access the web software. There's no linking whatsoever. So if you look down in the user type, you would just mark them as Express-only accounts. The vast majority of our accounts currently are Express-only accounts, meaning they have no counterpart within the FASTTRAK software. If this is true and you choose not to link and you want them to remain Express-only accounts, you need to just make sure that that username is a valid, unique email address. So for example, if they have a username today called user1, you would have to change that to an email address. Once that gets changed to an email address, that change is immediate, and that user can then start logging in with that new email address instead of their old username. And the last one is within Express, you have the ability to link an Express user to a driver account. So it's only applicable if that Express account is linked to a driver. If you don't have an Express account linked to a driver, you don't have to worry about this. But this is the linking that allows a driver to log into Express Web or to the FASTTRAK driver app application. So enabling them as a driver within the Express user settings gives them access to the driver app and the web driver application. So the goal here is to update the username to ensure that the email address is unique within that Express username. Also, it's very important that the Express username is only linked to a single driver. We do see some databases, for reasons unknown to us, where they might have 2 or 3 Express users that actually are linked to the same driver, meaning that those 3 different users can log in and see the same one set of driver jobs. It's most likely a mistake. It's most likely either an old username or forgotten username, but it's very simple. Just when you review your user list of an Express, just to make sure that there's no duplicate accounts and things of that nature. We feel that once you clean up your accounts and delete those unneeded users, most of those multi-driver situations will go away. And we'll talk about that. Any questions you have, we'll go through in detail. All right, so from a multi-system login support. So this one is, in the short term, you're not going to see much benefit, but longer term, it's going to make things much easier for any third-party affiliate driver, whatever it is, who needs access to multiple systems. We see this, for example, within Grid. Grid has multiple accounts to manage individual databases. We see this within third parties. Maybe it's an answering service or something of that nature. The answering service actually has to create a login specific to each database. Our intention in the long term is to allow a third party to log in using a single username and password, and instead they will select which system they want to access at that moment. Now, that doesn't give all third parties access to every system. You still will have to create a user in the future and say that this user has access to my system, and behind the scenes we'll manage the multi-system login support. So in the short term, we need to make sure that if you have one of those third parties, they need to make sure that they use individual email addresses. They're using individual usernames now, so just upgrading to an email address should be pretty straightforward. We are handling Grid since there's a large number of Grid support users. across a lot of our customers. We are going to handle the grid upgrade. So if you have a grid user that has access to your system currently, you can leave them untouched, and we'll make sure that we handle those as part of the update process. Now, once your system has been migrated, then that is when you can start to use a common login. But generally speaking, as an operator standpoint, you're not going to have to worry too much about the multi-logins at this point. You know, if as we're going through the upgrade scenarios and we take a look at your database, if we do come across this type of scenarios, we'll give you the best options moving forward of how to resolve it. All right, so I think I've left plenty of time for questions. I know we have, looks like we have 6 open questions, or actually 6 answered questions already. Let's see, Brian and Eddie, were there any questions that we've answered that would that we should go ahead and elaborate for within?
Yeah, Adam, Randy would like to know what we're going to do with the administrator account.
Yep. So the administrator account is absolutely an account in an individual database. So that administrator account will require, just like any other account, a unique email address. So what we've done by default is we've looked at your primary company and we've defaulted to that email address. But there's a variety of situations where the operator didn't have an email address in their company. So just as part of your reviewing your users, just make sure all users, including your administrator user, has a unique email address.
Following on the administrator question, Atif would like to know if he can delete that one.
The administrator account, that's a good question. I know it's there by default. I'll have to look into whether or not it can be deleted. My initial guess is no, because we always want to have one account in the system, and I believe there's some special constraints around the administrator account just to make sure that it's still, that it's always there, but I'll have to look into that. I'll take that as a note and get back to the group.
Okay, there's 2 that are going to be interlinked, TJ and Jennifer. TJ wants to know what multi-system means, and Jennifer wants to know what happens if she logs into more than one FT application.
All right, so you're right, those are somewhat related. So from a multi-system standpoint, we'll just take a specific example. Let's say you have an operator, an after-hours operator that answers phones for you, and maybe they take reservations for you. That operator needs access to your database so that they can add a reservation. But since it's a third party, there's a good chance that operator also that third party also services other operators. So you can imagine that one third party, that answering service, might need to log into 5, 10, 15, 20 FASTTRAK databases. What they have to do today is they have to create, because the Express accounts they already had to have unique usernames. So they've had to create several usernames to access each individual database. So what we intend to do is after the system is updated, let's say that third party needs access to your system. From an operator standpoint, you don't have to worry about what other systems they have access to. The FASTTRAK security platform will manage that for you. So you're still going to be able to allow that third party access to your system or not. By default, that third party will absolutely not have access to any FASTTRAK databases. They will have to have that operator of that database add that third party username to their system. That's the only way they're going to get access to the system. We call it multi-system login is because from a third party perspective, they don't have to manage 15, 20 different usernames anymore. They only have to manage one username to FASTTRAK. And once they log into FASTTRAK, depending on who's given them access, they'll be able to say, I want to access operator A's database. I want to access operator C's database. But only the operators that have given that user specific access. Brian, did I explain that well enough, do you think? Are there any other follow-up questions?
I think that basically addresses it, yes.
Okay. I see a couple of things here. So what if the drivers are already signing in with their email address? As of right now, if a user already has an email address that they're signing in, and you know, when we do an audit of an operator's database, we see the usernames that are in use. There's a very good portion of those that are already email addresses. As long as those usernames are unique, there's no problem. Where we see some difficulty is because Express was managed differently or independently from the FASTTRAK Ultimate software, there's the potential that you have a FASTTRAK user with an email address and you have an Express user with that exact same email address. Now, the assumption is that's probably the same person. And that's when, even though they already have an email address, if they need access to both systems, that's when you have to do the link. Because if you don't, what's going to happen is we're going to say, okay, I have a FASTTRAK with this email address and I have Express with this email address. Hey, I've got two users with exactly the same email address. Since there's no link, FASTTRAK's going to think those are two different users, and we're going to say that your system is not compliant. We're going to have to resolve it. So in that case, logging in as an email, if the username is already an email address, you're good. You only have to verify that that email address is unique within your database. Just a couple of scenarios that we see that are quite common. We see a FASTTRAK user that is, like A. Morrison, and then we see an Express account, which is the email address. Now, once again, they haven't been linked, so it's two completely independent email addresses. So in that, or excuse me, two independent user accounts. So in that scenario, what we would do is we would change the FASTTRAK user to an email address, and then we would say, okay, the Express user needs to be linked to that FASTTRAK user because this is the same person. Once we do that link within the FASTTRAK software, that login, whether they're logging into FASTTRAK or they're logging into Express, is going to be that one email address. And that's going to happen ahead of time. You don't have to wait for an upgrade or anything like that. The upgrade simply does stuff behind the scenes. So kind of all this, this linking that we did, all that goes away after your system's been updated. You don't have to link anymore. You'll simply check a checkbox and say, I want to give them access to web. I want to give them access to driver app, those type of things. So it's a much simpler process after the upgrade.
He wanted to know if you were going to have a step-by-step for the drivers to meet the new requirements. And the answer was basically as long as the driver has an email address in his or her profile and the username is the same as that email address, there's nothing further to do.
Correct. So, I mean, there's some anomalies that we'll look for. They're probably very few and far between, so we're not going to discuss them in deep detail. But for example, if you're a user that's linked to a driver, and for some reason the email address in your driver account is different than the one you use to log in, those are technically two different pieces of information. If they're different, that's going to get flagged when we do an audit before the upgrade, and we're going to say, hey, this doesn't make sense. What's going on? So part of you reviewing your systems, when I said that your Express account, if it's a driver, needs to have that email address. That email address should be exactly the same as the email address in the actual employee record. Brian, were there any other? I know there's a couple open questions.
Atif is this is something that may have need to be more emphasized, is about the grid. If they already have a username in there, you need to leave it alone, I believe. Is that correct, Adam? Because we are going to address that.
Yeah, we are going to handle grid since there's a very large number of grid accounts in our customer databases. So we are going to work with grid, and we're going to get a list of those usernames. And as part of our migration process, if the username is seen as a grid username, then we are going to automatically switch that to what we call the multi-system login. So let's say, for example, if there's grid, there's a username called grid operator A. That would be on a list of usernames that grid currently uses to log into operator A's account. After the upgrade, they would then log in with a common username that they use, and because that operator has given grid access to their account, they would be able to have access to that operator's account. So if you have a grid user, don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. If there's any questions, you can certainly let us know, and we'll try to answer for you. But if it's named grid, most of the usernames are named in some way, shape, or form grid. If there's a question, you could always send it in the grid support and say, what's this for? I urge everybody, not only today, but on a reoccurring basis, every few months to review their users in their database. Absolutely, from a FASTTRAK Ultimate standpoint, from an Express standpoint, review those usernames. If there's usernames that are no longer needed, you should remove those. Any username that's left over is a potential risk for people getting access to your system. And that includes whether it's a support account. I mean, question yourself is, do we need this account? If you no longer have, using Grid as an example, if you no longer use Grid service, then there's no longer a need for that username. So either contact Grid and say, why do you still have access to my account? Or you can remove that user directly. So that's all part of the review process. Tief, I'll answer this question for you because I've gotten a couple around the FASTTRAK driver app. So FASTTRAK driver app, as well as the driver view of the Express app. For those of you not familiar, the Express web has a full-blown view that gives you all the dispatch and all those operations. And there's also a very limited view that we call the driver Express view. A driver using that Express login that's been linked to a driver logs in with that username. So today, drivers could be logging in as just a non-email address. They could be logging in as an email address, whatever it is. If that driver currently has an email address and there's no required changes, nothing changes. Meaning that email address or the username is already an email address. It's already unique in the system. There's absolutely no changes that you have to do specific to that driver account. However, if that driver is currently logging in with a non-email address, then part of this process, you're going to have to modify their Express username to be an email address, the same one that's in their employee record. And you're going to have to let the driver know that once I make that change, they need to start using that email address to log in. Passwords will not be affected when you make username changes. So they can continue to use the same password. They'll just have to use that new username. The only time where passwords could be affected, so I'll go through this really brief. Let's say there is a FASTTRAK Ultimate user, so someone who's using the desktop, and then at some point in time, you also created the Express user for them. So the same person had access to Ultimate and access to Express, and you never bothered to do the link. What that means is those are two completely different users. But as part of this update, we highly recommend that you link those two together. Once you do that linking, since they specifically had two different usernames with two different passwords, once you do that linking, that login on the Express account is going to assume the password of the FASTTRAK Ultimate user. So for some reason, let's say your desktop user logged in, user one logged in with password as my password, and they log into Express and the password was yesterday's password. It was two completely different passwords. That's part of the difficulty in managing these together. But once you link those, that Express password goes away. So now in both apps, both Express and Ultimate, they're going to start logging in using that password that was initially set within FASTTRAK Ultimate. Now, if there's any resets, if there's any updates or change passwords, all that stuff, the current FASTTRAK backend will manage all those together and make sure they're synchronized. And like I said, longer term, all that goes away because there's only going to be one user. But in the short term, the only time the password changes is if you do that link, the Express password is obsolete. And both apps will use just the one password to log in.
Michael came up with a question here, and somebody else came up with it too, that I think I misinterpreted when I answered him before. Some of their drivers that no longer drive for them, they are marking inactive within their profiles, but they may or may not still have a username for the driver logins. They're wondering how to address that part.
So they have, so within FASTTRAK, they have an employee which they've made inactive. And at some point in time, they had created an Express account and basically said that Express login was a driver, correct?
Yes.
So at that point, they need to, if that, from a login perspective, if that login is no longer needed, they should remove that login from the Express list. That will not impact the employee in any way. It simply removes that link which allowed them to log in. So the user email ID could be any domain or has to be, a company domain. So it just has to be a valid email address. It could be any domain. From a cleanup perspective, we want that email to be viable, meaning there has to be an account at the end of it. The reason that's important is, after the upgrade, to support that self-administering reset process, a user to be able to say, I forgot my password. It sends them an email, and they get information on how they can reset their password. To do that, they have to have a valid email address on the end of it. So, there's for the most part, there's no reason that email has to be valid, but you're not going to be able to receive notifications when it comes to that self-serving reset process. Also, driver accounts should have valid email addresses. Because drivers receive notifications and things of that nature. So you wouldn't want to use a fake or an invalid email account there. But for the most part, the FASTTRAK software is going to allow you to put an email address as long as it's valid. It's got a certain number of characters, an @ sign, and a valid domain or extension. That's all the FASTTRAK software is going to do. If there isn't an account on the end of it, the FASTTRAK software doesn't care, but that user is not going to be able to reset and receive notifications if that's a part of their process. As part of the FASTTRAK user, within the Ultimate software, there's an option to do company security. Company security is solely within your one database. If you choose to use it, you could have certain logins have only certain access to certain company reservations and whatnot. It has no bearing whatsoever on login to an application. It has no bearing into anything as part of the global security update, so nothing to worry about there. When will the update be complete? Well, we'd like to have it done by the end of the year, but here's what's going to happen. So we have a global security update. There's a lot of work that's going on to get ready for it. Part of that, just to give you some context here, part of that work is also going to be embedded within the FASTTRAK software. So part of the due diligence to get your system ready should be done as soon as possible. And some pieces of this, like reviewing outdated accounts, should be done periodically, just all the time. We want to get our operators up to date so that when we are flipping the switch for the security update, that we can put that in place as early as January. So we will have the FASTTRAK software, another update of the FASTTRAK software, we'll just say a general update that has enhancements and whatnot. That will be going out in probably early to mid-January. Once that update is released, that'll be the earliest possible for us to start flipping the switch to do the migration. But from our perspective, the end of December is generally a quiet time. It's generally a lot easier to make changes. There's a lot less reservations going through. At least there's a lot more opportunity for that. Plus it's a new year, all that kind of good stuff. We periodically run audit checks on a database that tell us how valid a database is, so we can see a progression. And where our goal is through these webinar series, through our notifications, and also based on you guys' feedback, both the questions that we've seen within this Q&A and also the questions we get back on our survey, we're going to use that information and take a look at what are our operators looking for. Are there gaps in the information? Are they missing how-tos? Do they need another webinar? Do we need more direct access? We want our operators to be a part of this. We can't do it by ourselves simply because we don't know the answers. We don't know what users are valid, what users are not. We can help you and give you direction on what should be done in certain scenarios, but at the end of the day, only you guys can determine who has access to your system. So it's important for you to go through these steps based on our recommendations. And if you get stuck, if you have a question, you can certainly send it in support. We'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. But like I said, the feedback within the Q&A and our survey, we're going to use that information to kind of figure out what our operators need to be successful during the migration. All right. So to be complete, I would say, there's going to be cleanup in a variety of different ways. I would say once the release goes out early to mid-January, we'd like to be complete, within a week or so after that. But it all depends on, where our operators are. The biggest concern we have is we will not be able to either update you or we will not be able to provide updates and new functionality of the application until this is complete. We don't want to get into a situation where we can't either provide a new update, new functionality, we can't provide access to a new app that comes a part of your service because you haven't gone through the necessary steps to be ready for the migration. So that's what we don't want to get into. So we're trying to get you know, the operator side done by the end of the year, and then after that, we'll start scheduling and work with you to determine when we go ahead and upgrade your specific global security. But like I said, just to reiterate, if you go through these steps ahead of time and you change your usernames as necessary, update them, delete user accounts, you can do all that ahead of time. If you do that, there's going to be little to no change once we upgrade your database because everything's already been done. So you can manage those changes within your operation at whatever schedule you need. So you can do that before the end of the year, whatever time is necessary for you. And when we actually run the migration, there's going to be little to no notice change on how users access or use the system. If anything, they'll get additional functionality because they'll be able to do the self-service resets and things of that nature. So keep that in mind. It's really highly beneficial for you to work through this as quickly as possible. It's only going to give you access to the features and functionality when they're available. So.
Okay, I think this is a tremendous opportunity to make sure every operator, every one of our companies, to make sure that they have only those users that are active and valid logging into their database. Many occasions when I speak with people, we're working on either Ultimate accounts or Express accounts, and they'll say, oh, that guy left 2 years ago. Why does he still have access? He still has access because the management right now is cumbersome because it's not in one place. And that's one of FASTTRAK's goals in performing this update, is to make it easier for you to update and manage and control who has access to your database by creating just a single login form that you can manage. And in addition to cleaning up all those users that should not be in your system, getting them to where they're unique and allowing us then to upgrade your database, you're going to be significantly enhanced in your operation and have control over who's there. Adam, anything else?
No, I think that's it. It's all part of this broader security update that we're doing behind the scenes. A lot of things that you guys don't see, and this is very much a piece of that. And it's been a progression, and this is the last step to finally unify these users, and that enables a lot more moving forward. When we talk about next generation software, when we talk about FASTTRAK Insights and a lot of the stuff that we're currently working on, there's a requirement of that to be ready with the unified global login. So that's what we're working towards. All right, folks, looks like that's it. Well, I truly appreciate everyone joining today. We will go ahead and send out a notification about the webinar and make it available to the web or on the web so you guys can review it later. At the end, you're going to receive or you'll see a screen that says click here to leave this site and fill out a survey. I truly appreciate if you guys would fill that out. It takes about a minute or two, and it just gives us some feedback, not only in the webinar, but also let us know your concerns. Let us know how you're feeling about the security update, something we may not have talked about today. You can certainly put it in there and we'll review it and get back to you as necessary. So on behalf of Brian, Eddie, and myself, thank you guys for coming today, and we'll talk to you next time.